Unfortunately, episode 68, all about the monorails, is not going to be returning anytime soon. And that's unfortunate, but I thought I could replace it with some other monorail content. And the first story I wanted to tell was about the history of monorails as they existed in Walt Disney's eyes, what happened at Disneyland, and how they came to the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. So I wanted to kind of tell that story in a way here where we go through and talk about everything that's related to monorails. Now, I am wearing a shirt today that's the Seattle Monorail shirt, and that does tie into the story, hence why I'm wearing it today. But I wanted to tell you the complete story of the history of the Walt Disney World monorail. Throughout the video, there are a couple of voices that you're going to hear. One is Kim Peterson. He is the former president of the Monorail Society, and unfortunately, Kim passed away a few years ago. But I had a chance to interview him a few years before that, and it was kind of interesting because we had a wide-ranging talk about monorails and how monorails work, and I think it fits into the context of this story. The other is Bob Gurr, who I had the good fortune of being able to interview at some point in about 2017 or 2018. He was a really interesting guy. He's got a rich history with the Walt Disney Company, and he, among everything else he did, is primarily responsible for the way the monorails operate and look. So he's got an interesting perspective. When Walt Disney envisioned his theme park that became Disneyland, he had this idea for a futuristic part of the park. It would be something that would be looking at the future technologies of tomorrow, called Tomorrowland. It sort of evoked the idea of this fantasy of something that we could have in the future that might be forward-thinking, that might be something we've never seen before. And among the things he thought of was some sort of futuristic mode of transportation, something that would get guests from one point to another and really wow them, to make them think about the future. And more from Kim.
Tomorrowland was really a forecast of the future, and he was always trying to think of things that will make life better for all of us. And we've seen that in Tomorrowland.
And this is where he turned to Bob Gurr. Bob was a young Imagineer who had some really bright ideas and had already done some things for the Disney Company. And he said to Bob, essentially, I want you to come up with something that's going to be a futuristic mode of transportation. What can you give me? Here's Bob Gurr.
I either was lucky enough that Walt always threw stuff that was really going to work in my direction while he was still alive.
Bob saw an opportunity to create a train, something that would be unique and a little bit forward-thinking. And so he decided to use a car body as his main part of the train. So the chassis for a classic car, or what we think of a classic car today, and the motor for that car all became the basis for the train that he created. It was a smaller gauge track that could handle the chassis, and he and some of the other WED designers created something that was futuristic looking that they called the Viewliner. And shortly after the park opened, they had a working train that went around the outside and provided this futuristic view. It was a really cool idea, but it really was not efficient. The fact that it was based on a car and wasn't based on sort of train technology was problematic in its own right, and they had many issues with it. If you go back and listen to interviews with Bob Gurr talking about it at the time or read some of the books, you realize that there's a number of issues they had. So they needed to move on from this. And that's when luck happened. Walt Disney and his wife Lillian went to Germany in 1956, and they were touring around on their own and looking at things, and they stumbled upon a monorail that they'd never seen anything like this before. It was a beam that was going across, and it was sleek, and it was neat, and it was interesting, and it whisked people away to somewhere else. That was the future that Walt was looking for. The company that had created this monorail system was called Alweg. The person who created this monorail was named Axel Wenner-Gren, and it's a concatenation of his name, Alweg. So it was kind of smart, in that sense where he had it named after himself, kind of like Disneyland was named after Walt Disney. So there was this sort of connection between the two. And Walt Disney approached Alweg and said, hey, I really love what you're doing here. I'd like to know more about it. And thus began a series of communications between the Disney Company and the Alweg Company. And at some point, Disney sent Admiral Joe Fowler and Roger Broggie, who was the machinist who could do anything, to Germany to actually meet with the Alweg Company and see what they could do. See if they could maybe create a monorail that could be used at Disneyland to replace the Dreamliner. It was a great idea. It really was futuristic. It met all of the things that Walt Disney wanted to do. But it was totally happenstance and somewhat random that this happened, that Walt Disney and his wife had found this monorail and wanted to do something with it. There is a minor surprise as it relates to Disney and monorails. I'm going to let Kim tell you this story.
Surprisingly, it's kind of like a Peter Pan ride, you know. That's one of my favorite trivia remarks. When did the first Disney monorail open? 1955. Absolutely is a suspended monorail.
But there was a problem here. It's 1957. Walt had set a vision out there that he wanted to have a monorail in place at Disneyland by 1959. That was his goal. But it's a problem of how do you create a monorail in Germany at a small factory that then could make its way all the way to Disneyland, so it would have to go through the Panama Canal and make its way there. And the Alweg company realized there was no way that they could make that happen. The timelines were just impractical. So what Disney suggested was, what if you sent some of your engineers here to the United States? And we worked with a company here in the United States, in California, to actually create the monorails and the monorail beams based on your designs. Alweg was trying to find a market into the United States anyway. There was talks about going to Los Angeles and building a complete monorail system there. And this was like the perfect opportunity to make this happen, because now they would have a foothold and people could see the monorails in person. Now, as time progressed, as they were getting through this timeline of putting a monorail out there, there was a whole design consideration for how the monorails would actually work and what they would actually do. The Alweg monorails were a smaller scale thing that weren't used every day for large numbers of passengers. But here at Disneyland, with the number of people that come through the park, it was going to be fairly well used. So they had to do some redesigns on the engines and some of the components that they make to make sure that they'd have enough wear and tear on them to make it work. And some insights from Kim.
Disneyland had the unique challenges in it. It had a small area, and Walt, being the pioneer, wanted something really spectacular, and he wanted the thing to twist around like a bowl of spaghetti. So he had to make it a smaller scale, on par with the rest of the park having a lot of smaller scale stuff. But to do that, they had to change the design of Alweg's train. So Bob Gurr got very much involved in doing that, and he also came up with that iconic Buck Rogers look that we all love. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And Disney sort of went on their own, much to Alweg's concern. Bob Gurr tells a funny story about how they couldn't believe that, you know, they barely got the thing running, and then they put the vice president on it for a grand opening. So they just wouldn't do it that way. They'd rather test the thing for a half year and then get it going.
Yeah. But in 1959, on schedule, maybe a little over budget, but pretty close to it, they were complete. They had the monorail completed, the beams were in place, the monorail was hoisted up onto the line, and they were ready to go. Some additional insights from Bob.
The earliest one that turned out to be iconic is the first Disneyland monorail. That job came along very, very quickly in 1958, and still today, most Disney parks in America here have monorail. And the monorail always seems to be a super advanced, idea of transportation of tomorrow. But it actually, the look of that thing started out with about a 10-minute sketch on my kitchen table one day, and simple as that.
And Kim, a few minutes ago, mentioned a Bob Gurr story involving Richard Nixon. Well, here's that story.
Well, yeah, when Walt wanted to show off the monorail to his friend Dick, he called him Dick, I got copies of the letters he would write back and forth to the White House. They were good friends. Walt would introduce us all around, he and the wife and the two girls, and said, well, Dick, I'm the steam guy. I like to drive the steam locomotives. But Bobby here is the modern electrical age, so I let him drive. So that, obviously, Walt was not doing the driving. In fact, we'd only gotten the train on the testing only for about 2 weeks, and the train broke down every day except the night before the ribbon cutting. So we were barely ready to run it. So I didn't even have a chance to train the monorail supervisor, and he didn't get a chance to train any of the drivers. Mm-hmm. So the compromise was that in the middle of the night they made me a cast member uniform for monorail. So I was well dressed the next day for the television program and the ribbon cutting, because I looked just like a monorail driver. That's what we needed to do. So we just did it. as I read about American history, presidents pride themselves on attempting to escape from their guards. Happens all the time, all the families in the White House, wherever they travel or something. Anytime a president can suddenly escape them, they consider that quite a coup. This was totally unplanned, but the fact that as I drove off of the monorail, the Secret Service was just standing around. Nobody told anybody that we were going to go drive it. Walt was just showing it off to his friend Dick. And Walt says, well, Bobby, give him a ride. So I drove off. And in those days, the train would go out, make a slight right turn, then a left turn, come down over the subride, the waterfalls, which meant you got a good view of the platform. And Nixon immediately saw their Secret Service guys were all on the platform, which meant none were in the train. And he gave out a couple of very choice four-letter words about that, which horrified me because that just indicated I just kidnapped the Vice President of the United States. You don't do stuff like that. So actually, he enjoyed it, but I didn't, as you can probably understand. Then we came around and getting ready to slow down the station, and the girls wanted to go again. Walt said, well, give them another ride. And I was horrified because this was only the second lap the train's ever done on its own power without breaking down. Now we're going to do it a third time. And the deal was we had to park the train at that platform because we're going to cut a ribbon on live TV, so we don't want to mess that up. So driving to the station, the Secret Service were trying to jump on a moving train. Desperate. Very funny. But then we came around and for the second lap around, stopped. We all got out, went down to the bottom of the platform. Nixon stops, turns around, and looks up at the train. All the Secret Service are sitting in the train. Not one of them had the sense enough to get out of the train and follow him down the exit. So I kind of looked at the whole situation. I thought, well, so much for the Palace Guard. I don't think they're very good at what they do. But Nixon got a big kick out of it anyway with Walt.
Bob saw a future where he had this, what he called the bubble design, where it had that dome on the top, and it's very futuristic and really looked cool. It was much sleeker than what Alweg had designed. So he basically redesigned the entire monorail to look like he thought he wanted to look, rather than going with the Alweg design. But they only had a couple of weeks to test it out before the grand opening, which really caused some other issues. And if you read between the lines, because Alweg was responsible for the design, they weren't very happy to be putting a monorail out there that hadn't really been tested thoroughly at this point. I don't know if that's true. But nevertheless, the Disneyland monorail was opened on June 14th, 1959, to a much celebrated crowd with a lot of hoopla and Vice President Richard Nixon in attendance, because Dick, as he was called by his friend Walt, was invited to come and experience it. And here's Kim with some details.
Monorail was not put in just to be a ride. He was trying to show all sorts of folks how we could make trains real quick, get them up in the air and above traffic, and they would operate cheaper. And he was green before there was a green.
Now here's a little thing that I can't quite wrap my head around. Why do they have the name Mark associated with the monorail? Their first one was called a Mark 1. The current Disneyland monorail is called a Mark 7, and they've had every number in between. But why is it called Mark? I really don't know, but my best guess is it's based on the idea of an assayer's mark, which basically identifies them as being Disney's own. It's an assayer's mark that says it's ours, we created it. Now, if anyone knows anything different, I'd love to hear it, but I've never heard what Mark stands for officially.
They did have some problems with the initial design, and they went through several Mark series, and it kept improving them to make them operate better. They're above traffic. They don't mix with street traffic and pedestrians, and you're cruising along. It's kind of like low-level flying. So, it's not unusual to see kids with their face up against the window and watching everything.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm a big kid doing that. Actually.
I was just going to say the same thing. I've got my face up against the window, too.
Alweg wasn't quite done with the United States. They had a plan to create something in Los Angeles, but it never moved forward. But Alweg figured they could still make inroads in the U.S. as more metropolises were growing up all over the place. They could create monorails that could make transitions to mass transportation easier. And when the 1962 World's Fair opened in Seattle, there was a monorail there. Alweg put a 2-line system in that's fairly short, but actually has 2 trains running back and forth between the main part of where the convention center was and the Space Needle. And this monorail was Alweg's design entirely. It looks just like the one that they had in Germany, well, with a few modern additions because it was a few years later, but it was essentially the same one, and you can still go to it today.
And that Seattle monorail is the type of monorail that Los Angeles got very close to getting in the 60s. The Alweg company went to them and offered a monorail system across the whole city. All they had to do was just provide streets, and the city said, "Nah, no thanks."
That is the same design that really influenced Disney to a large degree. It's a remarkable thing if you ever have a chance to go up there and see it, because you have this direct influence, this direct line into what Walt Disney was thinking. Over the next several years, Disney continued to recreate this monorail. They refined the design, they figured out some things, they made some changes overall to make it more efficient. These 2 monorails that they'd put on the line in Disneyland, they were good, but they could be so much better. So shortly after the Mark I came the Mark II, and a couple of years later came the Mark III. And those were the monorails that were in service in Disneyland for most of its early history. And then came the plans for Walt Disney World. Walt Disney World was going to have a monorail system unlike the one at Disneyland. The one at Disneyland is sort of a guest attraction that takes you around the outside of the park and shows you around a little bit. The one at Disney World was intended to take people from the car and bus parking, which was all the way at the southern end of the property, to where the theme park is all the way at the northern end. So you could cross through where this area was, where there was the research park. But since it was such a long distance, you would use the monorail to get you there. That was the idea. And so the concept was that you had to create something that was even bigger, more expansive, and could handle more passengers. So they had to redesign the monorail again. And this is where Bob Gurr steps in again. He took all of the things that they learned from the Mark I's through the Mark III's and decided to build a better model, something that was more efficient and could last longer, basically, because you're going to be moving larger numbers of people from their cars to the theme park. You have to take it to get there. So we've got to make sure that it has an uptime that's really high and there's really no risk associated with it, that it can always be running. So he came up with a revised design based on that. And then he was sort of infatuated with an idea. And more from Kim.
Later on, the Learjet look that you see on the cover of my book, that's the monorail line. He basically was inspired by the Learjet, from what I understand on that.
He saw Learjets that were coming out in the late 1960s. These Learjets were these sleek-looking things that could fly through the air and kind of glide along. If you're thinking futuristic, why not go with a more futuristic design that looks more like a Learjet? A design like this is great, but the question remained, how would you build it and have it shipped from California to Florida from the facilities that you have? And that's where they hit upon the idea to go talk to a couple of companies that were in Orlando at that time. One of them was Martin Marietta. Martin Marietta was involved in the space program and had already built a facility in the Orlando area, not that far from where the theme parks were to be located. And so Martin Marietta went under contract to create 10 monorails for Walt Disney World. But the monorail beams, those concrete girders that the monorail glides along, those were a different story. First off, Bob Gurr saw the original beams that they put in at Disneyland as too sterile. They were just flat beams that went across. They were based on the original design that Alweg had. He wanted something more futuristic, something that had a little bit more of a flourish, an architectural style to it. So we came up with the idea for the arched beams to make the monorail look even more sophisticated, sleek, and futuristic. But where do you go to find a company that can create those kinds of beams? They had to search around a lot all over the country until they found a company in Tacoma, Washington. And they contacted them and found that they could make the monorail beams for them, and they could ship them by train to the Orlando area. So keep in mind, there weren't a lot of manufacturing facilities in Florida at that point in time. In 1969 or so, there really wasn't much in the way of manufacturing going on. Yes, there was a space program, and that's why the monorail made sense to have come from there. But the beams themselves, they had to be polished and made somewhere else. So this is why they went ahead and bought them from Tacoma and brought them to Florida. So over the course of a couple of months, maybe a year, They actually got all the monorail beams sent to Florida and were able to position them in place to get everything ready for the monorail. Then Martin Marietta finished up the 10 trains they were working at that point. Following the naming convention, these were the Mark IV monorails that came into service on opening day of October 1st, 1971. Now, there were 10 trains being created. At Disneyland, they only had 2. They added a third one later, but there were really only 3 trains that they worked with. But they were color-coded to make sure they knew which one was which and they could separate them out. In Florida, that became a much more important thing to do. With 10 trains, you had to differentiate them. You had to keep them separated from each other so you'd know which ones were on the line in which places. So the 10 trains were given color designations. There was red, orange, yellow, green, blue, black, silver, gold, pink, and purple. Those were the color designations that were given to each of the trains to make sure they knew where they were and they could keep track of them. Now, the design was that there were 2 loops of traffic. One was going from the Transportation and Ticket Center directly to the Magic Kingdom to take guests to their destinations so they can enjoy the theme park, and then around the loop to take guests back to their cars at the Transportation and Ticket Center. The other loop would be a hotel resort loop, so they could actually stop at the 2 resorts at the time, the Contemporary Resort and the Polynesian Resort, along with the Magic Kingdom to make sure that guests could circulate among the hotels. It worked out pretty well, but in doing so, you've created a very complicated system, basically, because now you can have multiple trains on the line. You could have, theoretically, as many as 3 trains on each line, so at any point you could have 6 trains running. Theoretically, you could have 8 running, but I think they wanted to keep it simple. But over time, this became even more complicated because they added another hotel, that would be the Grand Floridian, and then when they added the Epcot line later, they realized they needed more trains. So they added 2 more trains, Lime and Coral, to the monorail fleet to make a total of 12 trains. Those 2 new trains weren't brought on the line until 1984, 2 years after Epcot opened. In another video, later on, I'll detail out how some of the switches work and how they get the monorails to their destinations to make sure that they've got the right number of trains on the track at any time. But just keep in mind that it's a complicated process that requires a lot of effort and thought to go into it to make sure they know where the trains are, what's happening with them, and so forth. One side note that I'll give you right now is that the money that came from the movie Mary Poppins was used to help design up some of the safety features of the monorail. And so what they had was a block light system that basically showed them where they were by effectively having the train roll over it. It blocks the light out, and therefore they know that there's a train on that part of the track. And with the radio communication, it makes it a little bit easier to communicate and know where the trains are too. Hey, are you monorail green that's over there on that piece of the track, or is it monorail blue? Those kinds of things. So they could actually talk to the pilots who could give some information as well. But that system that was the blocklight system was called MAPO. It was short for Mary Poppins because the money from the Mary Poppins movie went into designing this system. I just thought that was a little fun side note to just keep in mind. In Disneyland, they had moved on from the Mark IIIs to the Mark V monorails that were more designed like the ones at Walt Disney World. Similar anyway, though they didn't look exactly the same. If you saw one, you'd know, hey, that's from Disneyland, because it was different enough where you'd recognize it being different. And those were put into service in 1987 in Disneyland. Disney World was also trying to update their monorail systems at that point. This was old technology. It was the technology from the 1960s that was built using the Alweg basic model standard that was adapted and then constructed by Martin Marietta. Disney decided that it was time to create a whole new monorail system that would update this. And that's when they reached out to the Bombardier Corporation out of Canada to create a whole new fleet of monorails that would replace the existing ones. So by the late 1980s, new trains were being brought in. Now, as I understand it, there was sort of this hybrid thing that was happening for some period of time where there was a few trains brought in, there were a few that were sort of retrofit, there were a few that were kind of configured differently, there was extra cars added to some of them. So you had somewhere between a Mark IV and a Mark VI monorail coming in for some period of time. You could call it like a Mark maybe 4.5, or can't call it a Mark V because that was at Disneyland, but it was something else. And it was just an interesting hybrid of ideas that came together. But by the time 1991 or so rolled around, all 12 monorails on the system had been replaced by these new Bombardier trains. They looked very similar on the exterior to what the trains looked like before. There were some subtle design differences, But the biggest difference was the way that the configuration of the cars went and the way the doors opened. Because previously, all the monorails were seated only capacity. You would open the doors manually with a little button, and guests would go in, and then some cast member would have to go by and shut all the doors. This new system increased capacity by 30% because they could open the doors automatically, and most of the room is standing room only. There's a couple of seats, benches that are inside of each door, but otherwise you have to stand up and hold onto the handrail. And it makes it much more efficient to load and unload, and no cast member has to go by and close the doors, which makes a big difference in terms of overall efficiency of the system. And this is where my fun personal story comes in. Back when I was at the University of Central Florida in about 1990, I had a professor who was teaching simulation. And one of his projects, outside of the scope of what he was doing at the university, was that he was working with the Disney company on figuring out what the times were between trains, how to efficiently get trains in and out, and what the load capacity could be if you were doing things the most efficient ways possible. So essentially, he was planning up for what they were doing with these new systems. And he would give us some of the data to work with so we could play around with our own simulations. Then he would ask us some questions in class about, what's the load time, what's the inner arrival time, all these things that we could use as real world examples. And it was fun to go over to Disney at times after we do these things and kind of think about, hey, wait a minute, the engineering of this is really cool because there's a lot of capacity management that has to happen here. The fact that they load the trains and unload the trains, they want to be in and out at a certain amount of time, that they can increase the capacity, that they can move this many passengers through was astounding. It was really amazing to look at the data and figure out, how long does it take the train to stop? How long does it take to unload? How long does it take to load? And all the other things that went along with it. It was just a really remarkable thing to be able to work on just superficially as part of our data set when we were looking at simulations. And I thought that was really, really cool. The oh, by the way is, the old Mark IV monorail trains that were taken out of service, a few of them were sold to Las Vegas, to the Bally's Resort, so they could run on the new monorail line they were building out there. So for a period of a few years, these monorails went back and forth between the two hotels that conglomerate owned. And that was kind of neat. And then at some point they were retired and sent out to the desert, and there's pictures of them kind of looking derelict in the desert, but it is kind of neat to know that they carry on. A couple of the other ones were sold off to collectors. I don't know what happened to them exactly. I remember there was one that went on tour for a little while. It was Monorail Red, and it went out and it was on tour a little bit, and then it sort of disappeared. And I don't know what happened to the other ones. I believe they were all deconstructed and finally demolished and destroyed or otherwise disposed of. But it was kind of neat to think that maybe you could have had a monorail in your house for some period of time. The other thing that happened when Epcot opened was that they decided they needed to have a way to get people easily from the Transportation and Ticket Center to Epcot. Now remember that the original intent was to have sort of this prototype community, this research park, somewhere between the Transportation and Ticket Center and the Magic Kingdom. But they'd already built resort hotels kind of in between, so that didn't really work anymore. So they had to build Epcot further away, kind of in an area that was to the southeast of where the Transportation and Ticket Center was. So what they decided to do was create a single loop that would take passengers from the Transportation and Ticket Center down to Epcot, and then that loop would come back to the Transportation and Ticket Center, and the monorail could continue to loop around that way. Now, over time, the idea evolved, and they created a parking lot in front of Epcot, so it became easier for guests to park their car there. But if you want to transfer between the Magic Kingdom and Epcot, they made it pretty easy to do that. So it still kind of works to a large degree, even though it wasn't what they originally intended. The next challenge was how to create the beams that the monorail will glide along. They had used this company in Tacoma, Washington back in 1971, but here it is about 11 years later, and they're trying to figure out where they can source the monorail beams from. And here's Kim with some details.
You made me think of one thing talking about the beam, too. I mean, look how small those beams are and how many people they can carry. The beauty of building a monorail is you really don't need that much material as you do for other rail systems. It's and you can build a track miles from where it's going to go and then truck it in and lift it up in the middle of the night, and you don't disrupt the area as much. Disney World was crazy. In the first monorail they built, they actually built the beams in Washington and shipped them across the country on rail.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was just wild. They decided to do their own beams for the Epcot line, and they're a little bumpier than the ones built in Washington. Let me say that.
The expense of taking them from Washington was prohibitive at this point. So they decided that they would actually create the monorail beams on site at Walt Disney World. They constructed a manufacturing facility for the concrete beams right there at Walt Disney World. It's kind of near-ish Disney Springs, if you will, and the building is still there today. The objective was to take the concrete, make it, cure it, and then put it in place. The only problem was the humidity in Florida made it a little bit harder to make the concrete exactly the same. So, if you will, the ride is a little bit bumpier when you go out to Epcot than it is on the line that goes around toward the Magic Kingdom. And that's just because of the curing process that happened in the way that they constructed the monorail beams in Florida. But it was much more cost efficient to actually produce them there and only have to truck them over a few miles to hoist them up into place and create this specialized monorail that would go around the Epcot and come back to the Transportation and Ticket Center. So when you hear the stories about how much it costs to create a monorail, remember that when they created it on site, the cost was much less than anything else they could have done. But Disney funded it themselves. And with the construction costs of Epcot and all of the other things, Disney really went deep into debt trying to pay for all of the things that they were trying to do. There was a lot of vision, but the pockets weren't as deep as they are today. It would be much easier and much more cost-effective today to create a monorail line if they wanted to. Because it's a smaller scale service, and there's only 3 trains running, the Disneyland monorail was ripe for an update. And in the early 2000s, they replaced the monorails there with the Mark 7 monorails. The question is, when will Disney World be upgraded to the Mark 8 monorails, the next generation that will happen there? And no one knows. There was a lot of speculation about it over the years. The original monorail ran from 1971 to about 1990, so that was less than 20 years. These monorails have run for over 30 years since 1990, so it's a lot of questions about when they will replace them. There's a lot of things that have already been replaced in the monorails. They continue to maintain them and keep them running, and there's a lot of things that they're able to fix and keep effective, but at some point it'll be harder to machine parts and make things work the way they want them to. It just becomes complicated when you're dealing with a 30-year-old machine. And some insights from Kim.
The Disney World, as you probably know, carries somewhere around 150,000 people a day, many times more. And something about monorail that a lot of the other transit forms can't do is they run at a 99.9% reliability, which means those trains can all be out on the track running and you can trust them to get to the station on time. Now, of course, there's that tiny 0.1 wherever there's occasions and the trains don't show up, but they're doing a lot better than other transit systems.
As we ride through the Contemporary Resort, there's one more Bob Gurr story that's worth telling. Now, there is one segment with him where I actually didn't capture this in an interview. We talked about it for a few minutes before the interview started, but we didn't actually cover it during the interview, so it wasn't in the recording, unfortunately. The thing that he talks about is how they tested the monorail going through the Contemporary. It was him. It was entirely him doing it and making it work to make sure that everything was working properly. He was quite sure that it was, but I found that kind of an interesting story, and I wanted to share it in context. But my thanks to Inside the Magic, because they're the ones who actually captured this audio. You can watch the original recording in the link I provided below. And thank you to them for capturing this, because, as I said, I unfortunately did not when I talked to him.
We had to test the monorail on, this would have been September 1st, this would have been Labor Day 1971. The structural engineers that designed the Contemporary Hotel thought that if a monorail went through there, it would be like an elevated train, you know, steel rails, and it would shake the building. We said, no, it's not going to bother the building one bit. So since I was the seismology expert in Disney at that time, we had a seismograph, a little portable one. So we bolted it down to the track, and then, even as you know, the monorail goes through the Contemporary Hotel at 5 miles per hour. Well, on that day, since all the employees were able to go home Labor Day, I was able to drive the monorail through the Contemporary Hotel to test the shake of the monorail on the hotel at 43 miles per hour. Now, it's a very small opening that you go through. I swear, the first time I went through, that opening was going to close down smaller than I was going through this thing. Train went right through the station. The recording of the seismograph never recorded a thing, no vibration whatsoever. and they said, do it 2 more times. I was just thrilled to death. The only time this is ever going to happen, do 2 more laps around the park, come ripping through from the south side, go right through the Contemporary Hotel, 43 miles an hour with only about 5 people present. I wish somebody would have recorded that, because I got that in my head as the wildest thing I ever got away with, driving monorails at Walt Disney World.
In another video, I'm going to talk about the monorail accident that happened in 2009, but I'll sum it up by saying that monorails pink and purple collided, and there was a fatality that went along with it. And those 2 colors were retired from the monorail fleet. But they used the undamaged components from those 2 monorails and created 2 new cabs, and therefore had 2 new monorails, essentially, that were put into service. These became known as monorails Teal and Peach, and they're currently in service around the Walt Disney World Resort. So you can see those still running around today. And what you'll notice is that now many of them have what's called a delta in them. That gives them a little color variation to make it a little bit easier to detect which color is which, especially when it comes to things like lime and green, or teal and blue, or coral and peach, because they look kind of similar to each other. It just makes it easier to differentiate them a bit. So you've got green with a black delta, peach with a black delta, teal with a black delta, yellow with a black delta, silver with a black delta, lime with a blue delta, red with a black delta, coral with a light blue delta, orange with a black delta, black with a red delta, blue with a silver delta, and monorail gold, which the last time we saw it had the 50th anniversary wrap on it. As I understand it, it has not returned to service just yet, but I imagine that it will have a delta on it once it returns. But I'll do what I can in this video series to talk about the monorails and things that we know about the monorails, especially in the historical context. What do they do? How do they run? What makes them interesting? And as I said, I'll be talking about the accidents and the switches in the future. So stay tuned for more great monorail content. To make one clarifying point, everything I've done in these videos, everything that you'll see in here, everything that I've got included in the monorail videos, comes mostly from videos that I took myself. If I took them from somewhere else, I note where they came from. And the second thing is, I just wanted to clarify that every one of these comes from a publicly available space. I don't go behind any closed doors or do anything awkward. This is all places that you can stand. Security will tell you it's okay if you're standing in these places. So just wanted to clear that up so you have that understanding too. So you can go and kind of recreate this if you want to, and go see these same places by just standing around on the 5th floor of the Contemporary, or down by the switch, or wherever you might happen to go.